Thank you all for being here. We're going to try to cover as much as possible in the time that we have. So I want to start with you, Jim. So we have, heading up to October 7th, we heard all the time that the president's team was directed to sort of keep the Middle East off the president's desk. You handle it. And we heard from some of his senior advisors that prior to October 7th, that the Middle East was the calmest it had been in decades. However, as we've seen, the Middle East gets a big vote on the matter of whether this issue hits the president's desk. And so I wanted to ask you to lead us off by, how do you characterize the Biden administration's approach toward the Israel-Palestine conflict leading up to October 7th?
I think criminally negligent is the word. That's a crime in U.S. law. They did their best to put it off the agenda, to not take it seriously. They're not the first administration to do that, but no one has ever done it with such zesto, to simply try to ignore the fact that it was there and that hope that it might go away. And when I look at the statement that President Biden issued to Arab Americans before the election in 2020, the commitments that he made, actually none of them have been fulfilled, and it was deeply troubling to us. So the one they restarted aid to UNRWA. They've now taken that off the table too. We've been pretty distressed with how they approached it, and I think that there are a number of factors here. One is that there's always a bit of hubris around newly elected presidents who have run on an agenda that they've, this is what I'm going to do for America. And the Middle East is never in that agenda. We've never had a debate. I mean, I always say that despite the fact that we've spent more money, sent more weapons, sent more troops, lost more lives, have political issues at stake and economic issues at stake in the Middle East, we've never had a presidential debate about it. It's kind of an issue that gets sidestepped, and then they get to office with an agenda, and it doesn't include the Middle East. And we never, in the end, if you look back to since the end of Vietnam, we never have judged the success or failure of presidents by what they've done with their agenda, but it's how they've handled issues, agendas that are imposed upon them. And all too frequently, the agenda that's imposed upon them is from the Middle East. Bush got undone by 9/11 and then his foolish adventures into Iraq and Afghanistan. Obama went to Cairo, made huge promises and pledges, didn't fulfill them, and then ended up blaming the Arabs for the lack of fulfillment. Trump's deal of the century and breaking the Iran deal. I mean, these are issues that I think come to haunt different presidencies, and Biden is no exception here. His line on the platform about the equal worth of Israelis and Palestinians, it ends up not being, I mean, they've used it so many times it's threadbare, but it simply never was. It was honored more in the breach than in the observance. And so ask me what their policy was. There really wasn't a policy other than kind of hoping it would go away. And look at what they did with in 2021 in Gaza. Look at what they did with Jerusalem. Look how they dealt with the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. Look at what they did with settler violence in the West Bank. Look what they did with settlement expansion. Basically nothing. They would make a pronouncement about this is what we want, as if somehow a toothless pleading or a toothless kind of statement of this is what we'd like to see would somehow change direction. And so, yeah, what did they do? Nothing. And where did the shortcomings come from? It comes from a devaluing at the end of the day of Palestinian lives and humanity. This administration may be more, and the characters in it that I've met with and spoken to, see Israelis as real people, multidimensional human beings. I mean, they suffered at October 7th. They were traumatized. They experienced real pain. They can't feel the same multidimensional character that inhabits Palestinian lives. They see them as one-dimensional kind of objects to be moved around. So if Israel says, leave this place and go to that place, that becomes protecting civilian lives. That Israel's doing more, Kirby says, than even our own military to protect Palestine. It's not just the 30,000 dead. It's the homes that are destroyed, the neighborhoods that are gone, real people whose memories have now been completely erased. The 7-year-old kid who knew how to get from his home over to the store or to his aunt's house or to his school, that entire neighborhood is rubble. And there's no accounting for that, no feeling for that, no sense of the reality that these are people who suffer. Not just Israelis suffer, but Palestinians suffer. And I don't think it's dawned on them till this day. They keep talking about the day after, which is not only hollow, but it's indecent. There is no day after when 30,000 people are dead. There is no day after when people have no homes to go to, when people are starving and dying of malnutrition. The day after is we got to feed people. We got to build homes for them. We have to protect them from the savagery of this brutality. But they don't see it that way. They see these as one-dimensional pawns who can get moved so that Israel will be secure, so that the U.S. will be able to establish normalized ties between countries in the region, which incidentally is never going to happen. But that's the only way they see Palestinians, a problem to be solved so Israel can be at peace. That is fundamentally disrespectful, and it is a fatal problem for American foreign policy.
Lara, I don't know if you agree or disagree with sort of that analysis of the administration prior to October 7th. What do you make of the response after October 7th? Is there an alternate universe in which Biden did not have to bear hug Netanyahu? Is there a shift or a pivot that could have been made? What do you make of the administration's reaction and response up until now to the Middle East being imposed?
Yeah, so I agree with Jim on everything he said. I mean, Jim knows this really better than anybody, the history of how U.S. politics has engaged with Palestinians. Your question, echoes something that we've heard a lot since October 7th when people criticize what Israel has done. They say, well, what else could Israel have done? If someone did this to your people, what would you do? Which is a very, I think, intellectually dishonest framing. It sort of presupposes that, everyone agrees that if a mass shooter goes into a school and kills some people and takes hostages, the answer is you bomb the whole school. You don't try to rescue the kids that are still alive. What could Biden have done different in a different universe? And I think one answer is nothing. This is who he is, and this is the political calculus that someone like Biden makes. The reality is that I think a different president could have and should have recognized October 7th as a profound, maybe this is going to be your legacy for history, foreign policy challenge. And dealt with it as such, and not dealt with it first and foremost either as an ideological test. Biden, I am the Zionist. If Israel didn't exist, we would have had to create it, and I will stand by it no matter what. That's my sense of identity, which is fine. You can have your sense of identity, but that isn't how you make critical national security decisions and U.S. foreign policy decisions. And hadn't largely responded, at least by all appearances, with a framing which says, what do I need to do to placate and preserve political capital with certain U.S. political constituencies? Again, irrespective of the implications for U.S. foreign policy, national security. So what would it look like to have done that differently? And I mean, some of this is also what Israel, Netanyahu could have done differently. I mean, the first thing I'd say is, I think it was correct after October 7th for the U.S. to stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel, with Israelis, in the face of this horrific atrocity, the atrocities that happened on October 7th, the taking of hostages, the killings, everything else, and calling clearly for accountability and saying we stand with Israel in achieving accountability. I think, though, the other side of that, maybe two sides of the same coin, is in doing so, laying out clearly some red lines of what it means to stand with Israel. It doesn't mean also standing in support of an Israeli government, which I think it was clear pretty much from day one, unless you're one of the people who says, don't believe what they say and what they do. They actually mean something different, which is a really bizarre way to engage in foreign policy or domestic policy analysis. But it was pretty clear if you listen to what they said and watch what they were doing, that the intention was not merely to retaliate against Hamas or trying to get back hostages. The intention was to erase Palestinian Gaza. It was to reset the table in a way that there would never be any problem with Gaza again, because Gaza as a Palestinian entity wouldn't exist. And it is striking to me that the Biden administration chose not only not to put down any red lines in that regard, but chose to pretend that wasn't happening. And you continue to hear this empty language of there is no military solution, we'll have to talk. I think it was clear from October 8th that for Israel, there is a military solution to Gaza, and we're seeing it enacted on the ground over the past 4 months. And where Jim ended this question the day after, I mean, the day after really seems to have meant pretty clearly the day after Israel finishes doing whatever it wants to do. And the US policy from the get-go has been, we're going to support you until you get there. And then after you're done, we'll talk about the day after, which is basically saying to the Palestinians, we're actually going to, let all your houses burn down and everybody die and everything. But, if you force us to talk about that now, you're the problem. The constructive people are talking about what happens the day after this is all over, which is, again, not responsible foreign policy. In terms of, though, concretely, and this goes to the question, what could Bibi have done instead of burning the whole place down to get at Hamas? I mean, other people have written this before, and I think this is where you see where the US could have played a really constructive role. I don't think there's any serious person out there who imagines that after October 7th, Israel would not feel obliged to and have every right to engage in some retaliative strikes. I think the US could have played a role there in ensuring that those strikes were proportional and targeted at Hamas and not forms of collective punishment, not using massive munitions, not displacing thousands of people, not killing thousands of civilians, and we're limited in scope and in time. I think the US could have played a really powerful role in helping Israel do what normally Israel or another country would have done in a hostage situation, which is look to negotiate to get the hostages back. And when you get yourself stuck from day one in a framing of, we will not negotiate for the hostages, and the US backs that, and then 100 days on, well, you do negotiate for the hostages and you get a whole bunch of them back, but now so many people are dead that you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and the day after isn't the day after as it might have been previously. The US, I think, abdicated the role of being the sober partner, the sober ally, saying, we get it, you're outraged, let us help take the lead in what needs to be a difficult negotiation to get the hostages back. Let us help with our allies in the region in negotiating with people who you have every right to be outraged at, who are odious to you, but you need to get your hostages back. We didn't do that. We just said, whatever you want, we're with you. Absolutely no ceasefire. Nope, no negotiations. Oh, you want negotiations? Now we'll do negotiations. You're done? Okay, you're done. That's not foreign policy. That's certainly not leading. Another piece of it is, a lot of we all know Hamas leadership is outside of Gaza. The US, as a superpower in the world and in the region, a major power, certainly in the region with our allies, could have played a significant role in supporting Israel and demanding accountability where there are Hamas leaders outside of Gaza, in demanding that pressure be brought on them to do what they could to get hostages released, to bring people to account in courts. Again, this is the accountability question, not just retribution. That was a route that people just chose not to go down. There's also the question of, genuinely targeted responses beyond Gaza. And let's be clear, when Israel says, oh, we're being absolutely targeted in Gaza while we kill tens of thousands of people, but by the way, in Lebanon, we want to knock off one guy, we can get a missile into the wall of his apartment and do no other damage. I'm not saying I'm in favor of assassinations anywhere, but again, after October 7th, Israel had tremendous support and solidarity from the world to take actions to hold Hamas accountable, not to hold every Palestinian man, woman, and child accountable. And they didn't do it. They chose not to do that. And the US chose to play along and allow them not to do that. We didn't set down on any red lines. The clearest of this was when we had, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, when the US didn't push back on the announcement of cutting off food, water, and electricity. These are war crimes. We have no trouble calling them war crimes when this happens in another place. Cutting off food, water, and electricity to more than 2 million people is a war crime. And we basically said, oh, well, our policy all along has been support, support, defend, defend, rationalize, justify, maintain Israeli impunity. And we talk about an end game. Our message seems to be, Israel, at the least you can do is just hurry up and get to it. Some people say it's genocide, some people say it's ethnic cleansing, whatever. Hurry up and get to endgame. And what endgame is coming, as it comes into focus, endgame is genocide, endgame is ethnic cleansing. And the implications for US national security interests around the world, starting with our commitment to Israel, which is not going to be safer after this, but for Palestinians, it's utterly devastating. We don't know where this ends, but it sure seems like it ends with a giant influx of refugees into the region out of Gaza, which will have massively destabilizing impacts on the region. We can talk about that. As a humanitarian, as a legal issue, what it does to Palestinians, it destroys even the pretense of respect for international law and human rights. We see Israel now, they said they did, we can cut and paste this strategy in Lebanon. Hezbollah now knows. And they're doing that. In the past day or so, we've seen Israel striking civilian targets in Lebanon to punish Hezbollah for shooting into Israel. I mean, the implications here in terms of escalation, in terms of a degradation of whatever standing the US had previously, it's almost unfathomable how we could get it so wrong.
Daniel, so is it too late? I mean, it's too late for nearly 30,000 people who have been killed. Is it too late? You wrote recently that Biden needs a reset on Israel. Biden needs to use his leverage. So what does he do? I mean, if we could wave a magic wand and change things, what does Biden do today to put Humpty Dumpty back together again?
Yeah, thanks. Clear, I have no expectations from President Biden. Unfortunately, we do probably need certain things from the administration to desist from enabling and facilitating and guaranteeing the continuation of the war, of the killing, of the devastation and the humanitarian consequences that flow from the continuation of that war. But I want to be quite clear that I don't find the American position unfathomable. I find it consistent, as others have suggested, with not only this administration prior to October 7th, but also with previous administrations. I think they've managed to hit a new low, given the circumstances, and a new low is a high bar, given previous American policy. So, to those, I've seen a couple of comments, what can we do? What can we do? I think there is precious little sensitivity to suffering when it comes to Palestinian lives on the ground. I think it's right, and I'm pleased that they are able to see the humanity in Israelis when they suffer. I think it is dripping with neocolonial racism, to use that, I think, accurately, that they cannot see that humanity in Palestinians. But apparently, they are sensitive to their own politics. And so this is probably the terrain on which you all can best challenge this policy and to try and block the bad things the administration continues to enable and assist. I really do not want to be in a conversation about what good can they bring on the morning after, because I think we should be battle hardened enough to know that the answer is America does not advance good on this question. It is about blocking the negative efforts. I would love that to not be the case, perhaps in a future administration, if public opinion translates into politics, which is a huge if, given the structural challenges that poses. And that criminal culpability, I think, if one drills down, it's that you still see most of the administration effort centering around this kind of strange bank shot, this multi-layered play that has a lot to do with geopolitics and a lot to do with refreezing the status quo ante of October 6th, that has, I think, accurately legally been defined as an apartheid reality. And somehow it is not centering and front-loading the bloody thing that needs to be the focus, which is ceasefire now. By the way, if anyone cares, as I do, about the fate of those Israelis being held in Gaza, alongside the fate of Palestinians who will never come back, and those who are suffering under appalling circumstances, if one cares about the fate of all of that, then ceasefire now is the absolute necessity. So where I go with that is the adult in the room will not be the US, but can the US do other things? And can it desist from the following? And let me just spell this out in quite stark terms. Israel could not continue with the actions it is taking and the devastating consequences those are imposing on Palestinians in Gaza without American munitions, without American weaponry. This is something that seems quite clear from my conversations with people in Israel, seems quite clear from previous rounds, which were nowhere near as intense or devastating or long-lasting as this one. Relatively quickly, the Israeli supplies are exhausted and there is a reliance on the US. It seems quite clear, given the end run around Congress, not that I think Congress may have blocked this, but nonetheless, that the administration has taken in ensuring the continued supply. So you cannot, and it was interesting to see someone who has been relatively silent until recently, but has found his voice and I think is thinking about what is going on and what mark he wants to leave, who is the EU foreign policy chief. It was, and some, I've seen some videos where they've interspersed Josep Borrell, who I'm talking about, with American, with the spokespeople for the US government, Kirby, Miller, whoever. You cannot say this is over the top or the mealy-mouthed language that they find to describe what's going on, and that we'd like to see this different and provide the weapons. I'm afraid you look pathetic. So first and foremost, that is huge leverage. Secondly, you had the International Court of Justice because the world is not waiting. South Africa took that case to the court. Remarkably, the US administration termed that meritless, while 16 judges to 1 in 2 instances and 15 judges to 2, with an American judge in the chair, in 4 other instances, found that there was sufficient concern and plausibility that the crimes committed could be in contravention of the Genocide Convention, that immediate provisional measures were called for. Rather than leaning in and saying, we didn't support the case, we didn't think the case should be brought, but the overwhelming findings, rulings of the highest court in the world. I think what this does when America has been standing on its soapbox preaching values, morality, law to the rest of the world with an ever more self-righteousness during the Biden administration. What does it mean when that ruling comes through and it is ignored by the US? But what was so criminal in taking that approach was that here was an opportunity to say, you know what, we didn't agree with this case, but We, of course, have to stand by the court, and now we need to see the implementation of ABC. And in order to ensure the implementation of ABC, this is what we are going to do as of tomorrow. Instead, pretty much on the same day, and it's no coincidence, of course, this happened in parallel, the US decided to withdraw its funding, to freeze its funding to the only organization, UNRWA, that is capable of providing some of the services which may ameliorate and alleviate, although not that much while the war still goes on, but nonetheless absolutely crucial and necessary when it comes to humanitarian assistance. So that's where we are. A couple of other comments, because I do want to speak to the fantasies and the fantasists who are advancing these fantasies, that the way you shift this is you get a normalization package between Israel, the US, Saudi Arabia. You use that somehow to get a ceasefire. This then is the on-ramp to a future of Palestinian statehood and to a reformed Palestinian governance. So rather than doing the thing that is urgent and necessary and doing it directly via a ceasefire, you place a series of high-stakes gambles on something which, let's be clear, is not about a future of Palestinian statehood. Maybe there's a geopolitical reason why America wants to pull Saudi more into its camp, which is legitimate, if you like. But it is not to do with the ceasefire and the Palestinians. And what you're betting there is, A, you've got the Saudis for the deal. I'm not sure you have. B, you've got the Israelis for the deal. Categorically, you haven't if it includes anything for the Palestinians. C, you've got Congress for the deal. You guys will know that better than I. And D, if you really want to be in fantasy land, as certain columnists in major newspapers in your country are, that this is the way that you're going to advance real statehood for the Palestinians. It's absolute BS, and it is a distraction, and a dangerous one, from what we should be focusing on. And criminally, it is another attempt to impose a discredited, unrepresentative, and let's use the word in its correct sense, Bantustan leadership on the Palestinians, because we don't want credible Palestinian leaders who can challenge the status quo. And finally, the two things that the administration have done, I would argue, are far too little, and they're not even being fully activated. One is this National Security Memo 20 on oversight and accountability of American weaponry. I think it takes several weeks for those reports to be registered. I would say suspend now and make sure the investigations go ahead. And secondly, this executive order with regard to extremist settlers, which could be useful at some stage if it is used to the maximum, but it perpetuates the fantasy that the problem there on the Israeli side is a few bad apples. And if only we didn't have a few extremist settlers. Is it a few, the four settlers against whom measures were taken, who are conducting these operations in violations of international law in Gaza right now? It's weakness, it's nonsense, and it's criminally irresponsible. And that's a long list of things. But you know, that's what we need to be mobilizing to change.
Well, so Barbara, I guess zooming out or shifting our focus to the regional implications now. I mean, without getting into a game of day after when there are urgent things that need to happen now. You know, I know that there have been serious concerns. There have been these bouts of, 3 U.S. service members were killed, and the U.S. Was pressured by senators and various think tanks and advocacy groups to strike inside of Iran and to potentially enlarge this war even further. Even though the administration did not go that route, there have been strikes in Yemen. There have been retaliatory strikes on Iran-linked militias throughout the region. So how concerned are you about not only this continuing to fester or, to this horrible situation continue, but to actually metastasize and become a wider regional war, particularly if there's no ceasefire in sight.
Well, first, thanks, Jamal, for including me with this incredibly distinguished group who all know a great deal more about Israel-Palestine than I think anyone that I know, certainly. I'm worried. The longer we go on, I mean, this is another reason why we need a ceasefire. We needed one a month ago, 2 months ago. The longer this goes on, the more we see the danger of the conflict spreading and spreading. And the death of those 3 Americans was a tragedy. This was at a base in Jordan. They were really innocent victims of our failure to get a ceasefire and to get the situation under control. Their mission had to do with countering ISIS, also monitoring Iranian weapons going through Syria, but it really is a terrible tragedy that those 3 were killed. The US felt obliged to respond. We've seen a lot of tit-for-tat strikes against Iran-backed militias. We've seen some precision strikes in Baghdad, which of course have made our position in Iraq even more difficult. I've been predicting for some years now, since the Trump administration assassinated Qasem Soleimani, that US forces in Iraq would eventually have to leave, and it is politically very, very difficult for them to remain in that country, even though there are numbers of Iraqis who do want some American presence so that Iraq does not become a wholly owned Iranian subsidiary. But it is more and more difficult, and the longer the war goes on, the more Palestinian suffering, the more these tit-for-tat strikes will continue. So it has to be ended. The fighting in Gaza has to come to an end. That said, we are still seeing some relative restraint on the part of these groups and on the part of Iran, which does not want a direct war with the United States, and the United States does not want a direct war with Iran. And messages are passed. The Iranians were very quick to assert that they had no prior knowledge of October 7th. Some people doubt that, but it's entirely possible that they were not aware this was going to happen, or certainly not at the scale that it occurred. And, you know, I have to chuckle when people complain, well, but Hamas gives $100 million every year to Hamas, when you think of how much we give to Israel. Are we responsible for everything Israel does? Well, is Iran responsible for everything that these groups do? The Houthis, of course, have gotten into the act, perhaps in the sort of wildest addition to this story. They're 1,000 miles away from Gaza, but they are the ones who are showing up to support the Palestinians, perhaps more than any other Arabs. And I think they're making it very difficult for the Saudis in particular to show that they are somehow champions of the Palestinian cause, when it's the Houthis who are actually doing the fighting. I am a little less pessimistic about possibilities for leveraging some of the cards that the United States wants to play in the region. I agree with my co-panelists that the Biden administration has definitely not done enough to stop the war in Gaza, and not enough to set guardrails around what Israel has done. But I do think that there is serious thinking going on about how to salvage something from this catastrophe. And I think we should be supportive of those efforts. Obviously, the ceasefire has to come first, but I don't think that all of these efforts at providing a new political horizon are complete BS. Maybe they are pie in the sky, but I think the people who are working on these issues do care. And I've heard from a number of Palestinian friends who have worked on the issue for a long time, and they are all proposing various solutions and ways in which to reorganize the PA. Now, it may just be reorganizing the deck chairs on the Titanic, but I don't think all of this for naught. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking of American elections, and that what comes after the Biden administration could be far worse from the point of view of any hope or prospect for Palestinian rights. Also from any prospect of engagement with Iran or a peaceful resolution of our differences with Iran. So I'm scrambling to find shreds of hope in this mess. And I continue to think that we have to look for those avenues and press the Biden administration, obviously, first to get the ceasefire and then to begin to take immediate steps. I'd be curious to hear, I know my co-panelists are skeptical of the idea of the United States or Britain recognizing a Palestinian state, but 72% of the members of the UN General Assembly have done so. There is a structure in terms of Palestinian offices, diplomats around the world that can be utilized. And I think we should take whatever practical steps are possible to begin to build a reality of a separate Palestinian state. One other thought, and Lara knows this because I had a long conversation with her last spring when I was beginning to dip my toes back into the Palestinian issue after many years of frankly just focusing on Iran and not on the Palestinians, you know, we need to utilize the tools that exist. It took the Zionists almost a century to get their state. They had to go through terrible trials and tribulations. The Zionist movement had terrorist aspects to it. It had political aspects to it. The Palestinian movement has been through a terrible century. It is suffering something like a Holocaust now in Gaza. I think we have to keep our eyes on the notion that there can be a Palestinian state. At one point, I was thinking that perhaps a one-state solution was the most viable, equal rights for everyone in historic Palestine. But I think the events of October 7th and since have shown us that the only solution really is two states. And so let's begin to work on that again in whatever way we can. And I hope I haven't been too incoherent.
Daniel, do you want to weigh in on some of this that Barbara raised? Is there any hope or anything redeeming about some of these visions?
I really want to suggest to people that it is not for America to reorganize the Palestinian Authority or the PLO, not for the neighboring Arab states, certainly not for Israel, not to appoint a new president, not to make it even less representative and credible among its people. This is for Palestinians. Step out the way, the US. Please don't fund the PA, because that funding comes with conditions that basically render the PA a subcontractor. That is what it has become. It's very important that people understand this. The attempt of people who, some of whom may be of goodwill, some of whom may have good intentions. I cannot speak to their intentions after what they have done in the last months. But the attempt to recreate a peace process which is designed to maintain an apartheid reality, and the PA plays a central role in that. Step out of the way. Don't prevent Palestinian internal reconciliation. If there had been Palestinian elections, if Israel and the American administration had not discouraged and prevented those elections, if we had a unity government, we may well not have seen October 7th. We may have seen a different Palestinian challenge and struggle. If you block every other avenue to Palestinian challenges to the status quo, then, and this doesn't justify anything, then of course you are going to get violence. Palestinians have the right to resist the illegal occupation. They have to do it under international law, just as Israel has the right to defend itself. But these notions that it's so neo-colonial that somehow some Arab state will usher in a new Palestinian leadership. And let's also desist from this fiction that simply recognizing Palestine is going to change things. If you recognize a state on the 67 lines, and you then the morning after say Israel is illegally occupying the state we just recognized, we will militarily withdraw that occupation. We will not back the state that's conducting this illegal occupation. We recognize East Jerusalem and the 67 lines, and we will take action. That's meaningful. But the nonsense around a symbolic act of recognition, which the thoroughly discredited PA and PLO are pushing for, is just another part of the fantasy fiction of sustaining, refreezing, maintaining a system which has been accurately designated as an apartheid reality. That's where we are. If you exist inside that framework, you cannot get out of it. You cannot get security, not for Palestinians and not for Israelis.
Lara?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Jamal, I think we're throwing off your order of questions, but I mean, I just want to add to what Daniel said, and I agree. I find it very painful that right now, as people simultaneously give themselves permission to not engage in a serious way to prevent the continued war crimes that are being committed against Palestinians, they give themselves permission to continue with the decades-old effort of telling the Palestinians what they need to do in order to qualify for rights or in order to move forward in the prescribed, U.S. and Israeli supported way of doing it. I find that deeply uncomfortable and irrational. I also find that this is not to say that there isn't value in people trying to imagine a different future. I'm not saying, I'm not poo-pooing the importance of thinking past the conflict that we're in right now. But if the starting point of thinking past the conflict is how do you resurrect a future that wasn't credible before, when it looked like there was actual political capital from the international community invested in it, you want to resurrect that at a time. And you're basically going to ignore the fact that for at least 20 years, there has not been an Israeli partner interested in any of those outcomes, certainly since the advent of the new Bibi era. It is delusional to suggest that if you just had proper Palestinian reform and if they just behaved like nice Palestinian boys and girls and do what we said, then you could have peace. This Israeli government, and I'm talking about every Israeli government since Bibi came back, but maybe even we can talk before that, some of the disingenuity involved in the peace process. The current Israeli government and the current Israeli population has moved headlong into the embrace of what I grew up calling Kahanism, right? This is Greater Israel on steroids. It's the outright dehumanization of Palestinians. It is a muscular Jewish superiority, Jewish supremacy, which has no space in it for even a by U.S. diktat, moderate, reasonable reform Palestinian Authority that will basically be Quisling and do what they want. There's no room for that. What we're seeing in Gaza today is a reflection of where Israeli politics have gone. And for people to try to sort of leapfrog over that reality, it reminds me of we had this project that we all were told to pay attention to from Rand Corporation back in the early aughts or early aughts, the ARC, which was this great plan for how you can make peace and have a viable, Palestinian state, economic viability. And it was the whole thing was presupposed on assuming that we have none of the political limitations in place today that we have because of Israel, this would be possible. I used to call it Sim City does Israel Palestine. I feel like a lot of what we're talking about is like post Gaza, what we'll do. But it's a new Sim City. I know is for old people. Whatever it is now, it's Second Life. No, that's old too. Second Life does Israel Palestine. It presupposes that there is a partner on the Israeli side that simply doesn't exist and has never existed, arguably certainly since the death of Yitzhak Rabin.
I guess so. That does lend itself to, okay, so this question of the political levers that exist here to, I don't know, clean house or change these dynamics in any way. I mean, we're talking about so many different barriers to the right thing happening. So, Jim, I know you've done, well, I know you have weighed in and I think done some polling regarding kind of the electoral implications of what is happening. How much is this going to impact the election? And what are the political implications? Does this potentially, I mean, I may be falling for this as well of, any crisis, no matter how horrifying, is an opportunity for something to change. And so you want to hope that it changes for the better, even if you've lost so much. Is this a moment where there are going to be political implications where some of the restraints in the U.S. political system around this, and what we saw is this knee-jerk reaction to bear hug Israel and to bear hug Netanyahu, who was couldn't get a fist bump from Biden before October 7th. So what are the implications? What is going to happen with the election, or what potentially could happen because of these policies of the Biden administration? And then what does that mean for the political landscape in the US, and what is then potentially possible for advocates and activists and elected officials to do that they currently apparently are not able to do?
Three sets of observations. One is that where Rashida began the conversation with, I wholeheartedly agree. There has to be a political challenge. These guys have to wake up in the morning nervous about losing an election because they've been on the wrong side of an issue that voters care about. And I go back to the 1968 election of Pete McCloskey, when he, as a Republican former Marine colonel, ran in a Republican primary against Shirley Temple Black, who everyone thought was the second coming. And he beat her. And he beat her on the issue of Vietnam, wanting to get out of Vietnam. He came to Washington, and people will remember him, my generation remembers him, as the guy with Paul Findlay who met with Yasser Arafat. I mean, he became very good on the Palestinian issue, but he came to Congress against the war in Vietnam. And when he came here, there were members of Congress who sort of had that kind of, I call it the Siddhartha moment that Herman Hesse writes about in his book, where when Siddhartha saw the old sick man and having been sheltered his entire life and said, "Oh my God, could that happen to me?" and had his conversion. That's what happened to members of Congress. It's like, you mean I could lose over this issue? Right now, they are still operating under the fear that if they get out on the wrong side of this issue, they're going to lose an election. They don't buy into the AIPAC position they get handed when they run for office and say, this is going to go on your website, or you can tweak it a little bit, but this is what we want. They're going to lose. And we've had some victories in the last couple of years, but this is going to be a critical year. I mean, if the six that AIPAC is targeting with $100 million is what they've said, but oh, by the way, don't say that it's all about money, AIPAC money, because that's anti-Semitic if you say it. Poor Ilhan had to pay a price for that. The reality is they're going to spend $100 million to beat a handful of people. Rashida, one of them. If the ones that they want to beat, if they win, that sends a very, very dramatic message to other members of Congress that say, maybe I could do the right thing. And because I have this club, I call it the I'm Really With You Guys But Club, members of Congress who come to me and say, yeah, I'm really with you guys, but I can't do it because what the complications, whatever. They need to get over that fear. And the way to get over that fear is a couple of victories. Now, we've been engaged in this effort around the country to do ceasefire resolutions. We had a summit in Chicago with Operation Push and a number of other local groups, Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, and others. And guess what? Chicago City Council passed it. Third largest city in the country. It was a huge victory. And now it's up to 60-something cities that have been doing it, sending a message that you don't need to be afraid here. You can do it. Now in Michigan, we're part of a number of other groups. Jewish Voice for Peace, again, the Arab American community is very strong. The Armenian community is very active. Groups on the left are very active in getting an uncommitted vote in this primary to send the message to the White House that there's enough voters in this state that care about this issue. And because the margins in Michigan have been so small in recent elections, if you lose this many votes, you don't win Michigan. These are Democratic voters who are voting uncommitted. That's a big deal if it actually wins. Not wins, but gets a significant enough number to send the message. So there is a sense here that political activism actually matters. and can make a difference. We've seen it in our lifetime on Vietnam. We saw it on apartheid. We saw it in civil rights. And we've continued to see, we saw it on issues involving gay marriage. We've seen it on the way guns, the gun issue has become a mobilizable issue. Women's rights have become I mean, the same coalition that has come together around Palestine today, as Rashida was noting, is the same coalition that has been spontaneously erupting for the last more than decade. And somebody put in the chat intersectionality. It's a word that gets flipped around a lot. But the fact is that there are connections here, and it is the same people, the same coalition coming together on all these issues. And it can be decisive in elections. And frankly, it is part of what the Biden coalition depends upon to win. And if they lose, they're going to be in trouble. Now, we've done polling. We did polling among Arab Americans. And where Biden got 59% in 2020, only 17% now say they'd vote for him. It bothers me as well that the number of those who say that they identify more with Democrats than a Republican down to 23%, whereas Republicans 31%. That's disturbing. The Republican number didn't move much. We've got Republicans, I confess, in the community. But the Democratic numbers dropped substantially. It was usually in the previous more than decade, the numbers have been 2-to-1 Democrat over Republican. And now for the first time since we started polling in 94, the number of Republicans for the first time is larger. And that is a problem for the Democratic Party that I'm a member of, that they have to figure out how to address. And it has to do with Gaza. Now, the final part of your question is, what can the administration do to win folks back? And I worry that, number one, there's nothing they can do. I worry about that. But even if there were, I worry more that they're not going to be willing to do it. Saying we want a ceasefire now, we're going to take dramatic steps, kind of like what Daniel was suggesting. We're going to stop aid. We're going to do what Reagan did in Beirut in '82. Suspend F-16s, stop shipping cluster bombs, publicly say stop now, make it clear. That would help. It would open a conversation. But I think some people are hurt enough, are angry enough, are troubled enough that they might be lost in this election. We wanted people to vote uncommitted in Michigan because having built our entire enterprise, over getting people to vote, we didn't want to tell them to stay home and don't vote. I'm not into not voting, but they have to send a message with this thing. What we do in November is it's going to be a different calculation, but I think that some people will be lost, even if the president took dramatic steps. I want him to take dramatic steps. I want him to suspend aid or make it solid condition and impose the condition. I want him to be very clear about a ceasefire, immediate, total, and sustainable over a longer period of time than people have talked about. I want him to do those things. So I'm not going to say to people, let's abandon Biden, which I think is a stupid idea. It doesn't go anywhere. But do I think he can do it? He could do it. He has the capacity to do it. I don't think he has the political wherewithal in his own framing of the issue to do it. I just don't think that this president sees the urgency of it the way we do. And his staff going to Michigan as they did, either most people boycotted the meetings. 2 of the meetings were completely canceled. The third outing, some people went, but it was reported. I love the way the media played. It was reported he met with Arab American leaders, and there were 4 in one of the meetings. They're the only ones who wanted to show up. And then they leaked it to the media with we're really sorry and we regret everything that happened and the way Palestinians have died, blah, blah, blah. If you regret it, do something about it. But when the question came up to them, are you going to call for a ceasefire? They said no. So I don't know how regretful they are when they won't take the step to stop it. And as long as they won't take those steps, I just don't see people turning around. The mood in the community is very upset, and hurt, angry. And look, in 2020, I had people after the Bernie loss and the way he lost and the way Democratic majority for Israel intervened with these ads on Bernie. People were angry and they didn't want to vote. And I remember we organized an effort in Pennsylvania and Michigan to basically tell people, hold your nose and do it. This is much better than Trump. People at the White House have told me, yeah, when it comes to November, your folks will, facing a binary choice, they'll come back and they'll support the president. We already tried that in 2020. And I'm not willing, personally not willing to go to Dearborn or go to Chicago or go to Paterson, New Jersey, and get myself massacred because I did something that I knew so flew in the face of people's very deep hurt, very deep anger. They gotta, if they want our vote, which is what the mayor of Dearborn said, you want our vote, you gotta talk to us about policy and change it. Don't come to us saying we've done nothing for you, but we want you to vote for us because we're better than the other guys. We already tried that one 4 years ago, and we didn't get a whole lot here. So I think there's a real problem, and that's it. That's all I got.
This is a
Oh,
conversation.
let me tell you one more thing about the polling. Black voters and young voters under 29. Look, one of the problems with Democrats is that they gave up on the traditional Democratic coalition of the 70s, 80s, the ethnic working class voters, the ones who had built the Democratic Party back during the period between the two wars and since. People in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, we lost incredible numbers of elections because we ignored ethnic voters, which I chair that council in the party, and they feel abandoned. So they relied on what was called the Obama coalition of young voters and voters of color and professional women. Well, I can't speak to professional women. My poll didn't include a group that could be measured that way. But we did poll with Black, Latino, Asian voters and young voters. And guess what? The numbers were striking, like 3-1, saying that they were pissed off at the administration's policies, and a significant majority saying that they weren't going to vote for Biden. It's very interesting. You can't lose the traditional ethnic coalition and lose the Obama coalition and still win. Sorry, I'm going on too long.
Well, this is a conversation I really actually would like to continue at another point. I think this is essential right now, and going to be essential to what NIAC Action is doing. And I think if we're talking about this moment as, again, an opportunity to build something, to leverage this crisis, to change things so that we prevent the next one, I think this is a vital conversation. So I think we will look to set that up as our next meeting. For folks who are not part of a NIAC chapter or leadership council, you can sign up to do that and be a part of some of those discussions. Obviously, we work with a wide range of other organizations and individuals, and so we're going to make sure that we are part of that effort to organize and build this into a powerful block that can influence situations like this more than we currently are able to. So with that, I just want to say thank you to all our panelists. Thank you so much, friends, for your insights. Everybody that's on, we'll make sure to send around some of the really great op-eds and appearances that our panelists have made elsewhere. Lara, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just to make clear, I think some of us on the panel are 501c3 nonprofits. We are not engaged in anything partisan. We're here as subject matter experts like me talking about this. We're not endorsing or in any way in the partisan piece of this. So just to be clear.
I should make that very clear. And even as we talk about this issue, I'm not saying one way or the other which side to weigh in on. That would be for another conversation, but yes.
I'm speaking on behalf of me
yes.
and my people in the community that I been working with, certainly not my institute. Thanks for that, Laurie, but that has to be mentioned, obviously. It's a concern.
Yes.
Yeah, also for me, I'm only speaking on behalf of myself. So make that clear.
Absolutely. Anyway, thank you everybody for being here. I wish we had a more hopeful conversation, but the work continues. So as I said, we will be in touch with everybody who joined with follow-up materials. We will be in touch about follow-up meetings. And until then, keep doing what you're doing. Keep up the good work. And we will be in touch. Take good care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.